Okay guys, so I decided to redo the lectures that were covered in term 1 in order to ensure that everyone has fair access to notes, who registered late, etc, etc. So basically everyone will have the same opportunity with the course. You just have to work through the materials and you should have no trouble passing at the end of the day. So guys, chapter 1 looks at globalization and the global business imperative. Okay, we're going to look at what globalization is shortly, but the global business imperative, the word imperative refers to why businesses decide to go global, i.e. why they don't just trade inside their countries, why they make decisions to go into other countries and do business there. Okay, so in this lecture we will be looking at what globalization is, the various drivers of globalization. We'll look at multinational enterprises and how they've grown over time, and why businesses expand abroad, which relates basically to the drivers of globalization. We'll look at international trade theories, and we'll also touch on the role of multinational enterprises, that is MNEs, in the world economy. Okay, there are two videos that you need to watch. Both of them relate to what globalization comprises. The first one deals with what is globalization, and and the second video, what are the impacts? And the second video deals with the impacts of globalization. You will see on the slides that I provide you with the links on YouTube, what you can search for on YouTube, or alternatively you can just go to Blackboard and watch the video as it has been uploaded to Blackboard. It is your decision how you want to go about doing this. Okay. While you watch the videos, you need to answer the following questions. So you need to take notes for yourself, guys. What is globalization? What are the drivers of globalization? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of globalization? Important, guys. Important. Don't just go to the feedback. It's not going to really inform you how this all works, and you are more likely to learn if you have worked out the questions for yourself. So sit down, watch the videos, then answer the questions, and then look at how your answers relate to the feedback that I have provided for you. So the first question was, what is globalization? Globalization is the world becoming interconnected both financially and culturally through multinational corporations that travel across to different countries, but also through the sharing of media. For example, guys, we watch YouTube, we watch Netflix, we watch ITV, we watch multinational movies, etc., guys. All of these things influence the things that we do, the clothes that we wear, the fashions that we follow, the way we do our makeup, who we regard as influential, etc. So essentially, through globalization, the world is becoming a smaller place through you said communication, multinational corporations that are sharing products and services across the globe, culture that is being shared by these multinational corporations, but also through various sources of media, but also through multinational trade of goods and services, which are now available across the globe. The second question was, what is the impacts, or what are the drivers of globalization, rather? So in the videos, they mentioned things like multinational corporations. So these companies, Coca-Cola, I guess like Samsung, IBM, Microsoft, Huawei, bugger, why did I get stuck for a second? I can always think of these things off the top of my head when I don't need to. But basically, guys, all of these Pepsi-Cola, cigarette companies, McDonald's, Burger King, you name it, all of these companies have influenced our fashions, our tastes, etc. So they've persuaded us to eat hamburgers, wear Western clothes or particular clothes, to listen to particular music, to follow particular fashions, etc. But globalization is also driven by technology. So communication, as we already mentioned earlier, you can now, through the internet, you watch movies, video clips, bands, whatever, from all over the world, and this influences your tastes and your desires for particular goods and services, etc. But also technological transport has improved, i.e. the transport of goods and services across the globe has become infinitesimally easier through container ships, air transport, etc. And all of these things have made goods and services more accessible to us, and made them more available to us, and we now use goods and services that we've never have thought of using in the past. Chances are the clothes that you are wearing at this current moment, the cell phone that's in your pocket, even the food in your fridge, many of that has come from a country other than our own country. So, but they also mentioned, guys, that globalization is not new. It dates back to the Middle Ages, in other words, the 14, 15, 1600s, when there was a Silk Road between China and Europe. They used to transport things like silk, spices, salt, etc. On camels between these countries. But also, guys, the whole reason for Old Van Riebeeck coming to the Cape was due to globalization, because he created a stopover station, a rewatering or a refreshment station for the Dutch East India Company ships that were traveling from the east to Europe, so that they could get fresh goods such as meat, vegetables, fruit, etc., so that the seamen would not catch something known as scurvy. So globalization is pretty much as old as man itself. We've been trading goods and services for as long as we've been around. The third question third question asked, what are the various advantages and disadvantages, or what's the various impacts of globalization? Okay, so let's go through the positive impacts. Economic growth. Countries are becoming richer because of globalization. More trade, more sharing of goods, services, knowledge. So new technology and knowledge get shared more easily because of globalization. We get access to cheap products. In fact, you've got access to more products today than your grandparents or even your parents had 30 or 40 years ago. We've got more products available to us than we've ever had in our lifetime. The other argument is competition, so goods become cheaper. We all want cheaper goods that essentially fulfill our needs, our tastes, etc. So the economy has become more efficient. There's been job creation, especially in developing countries, because many companies move their production facilities to developing countries because the labor is cheaper, and essentially it enables them to make cheaper goods and provide cheaper services, etc. For example, Apple has, or most of Apple's computers are produced in China because it's cheaper to produce them, even though it is an American brand. But okay, so what are the downsides of globalization? The negative impact, environmental problems. So we're busy using up all the Earth's resources, and we're polluting the Earth, creating global warming, weather problems, etc. The world is becoming used up due to globalization. Then developing countries often exploit developing countries for their labor and for their raw materials, etc., which is quite prominent in Africa. Culture is being lost. So we're becoming one global culture, but this has a consequence that our own cultures are being lost in the process, and foreign powers interfere in local business or local governments, which is quite obvious if you look at, for example, America's interference in many foreign countries at the moment, and also China's interference, for a matter of fact. But probably one of the biggest negative consequences that isn't mentioned in the video is currently the spread of COVID-19. So the spread of diseases and viruses, etc., has become a lot easier because of globalization. Something that 100 years ago would probably, maybe a little bit more than 100 years, let's say 120 years or 150 years ago, a virus would break out in a country or in a village, people get sick, they die, and it wouldn't go much further. Today it spreads across the globe. We have tens of thousands of sick people in South Africa that were infected by people who came into South Africa who got a virus that did not originate in our country. So globalization also has very negative impacts at the end of the day. Okay, so guys, we've gone over what is globalization, but businesses want to create what is known as a sustainable competitive advantage. In other words, they want to be able to sell their products ahead of their competitors. So how do they achieve this? By offshore expansion. So to gain location-specific advantages, i.e. to gain access to new markets, to gain access to cheaper labor to produce their products or services, or to get closer to their new markets, etc. So modern business environment is chaotic, turbulent, volatile. It's changing all the time. I think we would never have predicted at the beginning of this year. In fact, for those of you who were in class at the beginning of the year, I would never have said that the coronavirus would have the impact that it has today. And that is the reality of global business. Guys, the world is changing overnight. Businesses are closing, new businesses are starting. It's very difficult to predict what is going on in the world. Okay, so guys, they mentioned about globalization. In fact, it dates back to long before the dates on the board here. You can probably go back to early Christian times, or sorry, I use Christian. It's like in the Roman Empire was an example of globalization, where one country had literally taken control of huge amounts of the global space in order to grow their own empires. But if we go through in terms of globalization, the first phase was 1870 to 1914. What happened then, guys? We had something called the Industrial Revolution, which meant that steam power and later electricity was discovered, which meant that goods and services could be produced a lot more efficiently. So factories started. They needed raw materials to feed these factories, which were predominantly in Europe at this stage. So what did they do? They colonized Africa, Asia, South America, etc., in order to feed the need of these factories. The second wave of globalization was after the Second World War, which ended in 1944. With the Second World War, there was mass production, and this mass production carried over into peacetime, and literally the expansion of goods and services such as cars, washing machines, all sorts of appliances, etc., became more commonplace within the world. As you've already said, guys, in the video, it's complex, it's debated, there are clear advantages and disadvantages, and there are parties that are very much against globalization, because they argue that it is very negative for many developing countries that get abused and misused by more powerful developed countries. Okay, so to understand globalization, guys, I'm going to break it up into the two core perspectives. First perspective, the first perspective is the sociological perspective, i.e., guys, if you look at that top right-hand corner, you've got Facebook, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, all these, what's the latest video sharing app, short little videos, anyhow, Flickr, you name it, guys. Bottom line is, we are developing a world culture. So globalization, a process which embodies transformation in the spatial organization of social relations and transactions, generating transcontinental or interregional flows and networks of activity, interconnection, and the exercise of power. Sounds very complex. But the bottom line is, guys, our fashions are becoming global. We wear clothes based on global fashions and trends. We use products based on global fashions and trends. Just think of the growth of coffee and the drinking of coffee. Guys, a few years back, what do we drink? Frisco and Coffeeays. Today we drink espressos and lattes and cappuccinos and what's the whites? Huh? Flat whites and all those sort of things. Guys, this is globalization in action. It's changing our tastes and the things that we do. The second perspective is the economic perspective. Okay, guys, the world is becoming one single marketplace, i.e. trade between countries is becoming much greater and countries are much more reliant on one another, and markets are therefore global markets. Guys, I always think of McDonald's, which is available across the globe. It's a case of global markets where it's an American burger brand that was started in America in, I think, in the 50s or 60s, and is now dominates the globe. And what has happened is multinational corporations have literally moved across the globe and they do business across the globe. So as I mentioned, my cell phone is Huawei, which is Korean, Chinese. My laptop or my tablet is an Apple, which is American but produced in China. My Nutella chocolate spread that my daughter puts on her croissants is Swiss. My water that I drink is, not that I do, but the water that we drink is French, bottled, spring water, etc. Guys, the world is becoming one huge interrelated global marketplace through the movement of people, in other words, labor and knowledge technology. For example, guys, Singapore and Dubai have huge numbers of expats. In fact, Dubai has something like 80% of its population is expats, in other words, people from outside of Dubai, and Singapore has more people in it that are non-Singaporean than are Singaporean at the end of the day. Okay, I'll get back to that point just now. Okay, advantages and disadvantages of globalization. I have already touched on this in the video, so I'm just going to skim over the slide as I did in class. You can also use your own examples here, guys. The point is that you grasp the concept. So if you look at the slide, guys, the integration of economy. So we're able to get goods and services from all over the world, which is great, guys. We've got access to more goods and services than we've ever had in the existence of humankind. The problem with that, so the advantage is integration of economies and access to goods and services, but the negative side is that we then become very reliant on these other economies, and when something goes wrong there, it can have a very bad ripple effect. For example, now with the coronavirus, the American economy has gone into a recession, and that means that they are consuming less goods and services, which means that our factories in South Africa are producing less goods and services. Essentially, we are losing jobs in South Africa because of something that is going on in America. Okay, so what are the other? Communication, guys, great advantage of globalization. We are able to communicate with people across the globe. I want to speak to someone in America. I make a WhatsApp call. It is essentially free. It just costs me a small amount of money for the data concerned. I can communicate all across the globe. Recognition, brands, so we know about what we are buying. So growth developing countries are growing, more industries are moving to those countries, more people are getting employed, etc. The argument is that less people are poor than was 50 or 60 years ago, although that is measured against the IMF, International Monetary Fund's measurement of poverty, which I think is an income of $2 a day, which is not particularly much money. Okay, so free trade, the movements of goods and services, wonderful technology expanding. We can do things that we could never do before. In fact, I'm typing these notes using Google voice recognition, which was unheard of. In fact, voice recognition a few years back, I had to buy very expensive software that didn't work very well. And now I can essentially do it for free in Google. Great. An American firm that's enabling me to be a more effective lecturer. So the world's becoming smaller effectively. What's the downsides, guys? If you go around it, we've already mentioned inequality. You have powerful countries that can bully smaller countries or less powerful countries into doing what they want. Goods are, or the production of goods is outsourced, which is an advantage for the countries to which it is outsourced. However, it means that jobs are lost in developed countries and that jobs are gained in developing countries at the end of the day. Okay, brands. I think the jury is out on brands. We pay a huge premium because something is branded. It is more valuable in inverted commas because it is branded, which is also very questionable. Exploitation is rife under globalization. So multinational corporations go to developing countries and they don't necessarily follow the laws or the norms that they would at home. A pertinent example was Nike in Vietnam that made use of child labor to produce those expensive sneakers that you like so much. So, the environment, we already said, is suffering. We're using up all the resources. Capitalism, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. We're losing our cultural identities due to globalization. So we are losing who we were and our national identities. And there's also, we've mentioned, disease moves freely. And the current pandemic is a blatant example of a disadvantage of globalization, and also then terrorism moves freely across the globe. In fact, you don't even need to be in a country to commit terrorist acts these days. So there are a whole number of advantages and disadvantages associated with globalization. My little slide over here, McDonald's. Okay, well, it's down in, but anyhow, you have better access to products and services from different countries, but at the cost of our cultural heritage. So we lose ourselves in the process. So it is a debate about whether globalization is actually better or not at the end of the day. Okay, now, the drivers of globalization. Okay, so I've got another definition up for you here of globalization. Globalization can be defined simply as the growing interdependence of countries worldwide through increasing volume and variety of cross-border transactions in goods and services, as well as international capital flows. So the movement of goods, services, and people across borders essentially defines globalization according to this definition, essentially a financial definition. Now, what are the drivers of globalization? We covered some drivers in the video, but I'm going to now break them down into specific drivers. Okay, so the question is, why do businesses go global? And there are four key drivers of globalization, or business drivers of globalization. First one is cost drivers. Businesses go to countries where they can produce their goods or services more efficiently, i.e. at lower costs, in greater numbers, at less expense, or where the workforces are more efficient at the end of the day. The currency of the country in which the goods or services are produced also affects this. So if a current country has a weak currency, it makes sense for multinational corporations to go open their production facilities in those countries. There's something there mentioned, economies of scale. So it essentially makes sense for multinational corporations to open factories that they can produce the full amount of goods that that factory can produce in order to reduce their operating expenses, i.e. Your fixed expenses are your water, lights, labor force expenses, etc. And you want to produce the optimal amount of goods in a factory in order to reduce your fixed expenses on that product or service. The second driver of globalization is market drivers. Okay, so multinational corporations move to other countries because they provide new markets for them, i.e. they provide new places for them to sell their goods and services. One of the best examples of this is Coca-Cola, an American brand that basically had sold all the Coca-Cola that they could in the United States. So what did they do? They looked to other countries to expand to. And today Coca-Cola is available in just about every country on earth. So because tastes and trends are changing, it opens up opportunities for multinational corporations to move across countries. Other examples are such as K-pop, which my daughter listens to. Korean pop would have been unheard of to listen to previously, but why do we listen to it, or why does my daughter listen to K-pop now? Because she has heard it on YouTube or social media, and her friends have heard it, and it's influencing her taste in music in South Africa, and she listens to something that she would never have listened to before. In fact, BTS, the band that she listens to, is the only Korean band ever to sell out Wembley Stadium in the UK. It's the first time that a band from the East has sold out a stadium, and it gives you an idea of how cultural globalization is working at the end of the day. Other examples, Harry Potter, Star Wars, etc. We buy their merchandise, we buy their branded products, etc. The third driver is government drivers. So what do governments do? They encourage foreign businesses to come to their shores. How do they do this? They offer them tax breaks, so they give them tax discounts. They may even give them money to come there. Why would they do that, guys? It's because foreign businesses employ their people. These people pay tax, they spend money, the economy grows at the end of the day. So often multinational corporations move to countries where the government has provided them with incentives. A huge example of this is Dubai, where you've got free trade areas where people don't pay tax, etc. And Dubai's economy is thriving because of this. Okay, it's also true that countries can also close their borders and become less receptive to foreign countries or foreign companies in order to discourage them for various reasons I'll get into in a later lecture. Then, guys, the fourth reason is competitive drivers. Businesses move into markets in order to stay competitive. So examples is Burger King and McDonald's that have moved around the globe pretty much together. Burger King came to South Africa so that they would not lose complete market advantage within South Africa, i.e. McDonald's had moved here, and if they didn't come to South Africa, chances are they would not get the opportunity to open here because McDonald's will have dominated the market. So businesses, in order to remain competitive, move into foreign markets where their competitors are, or they move into foreign markets before their competitors get there. Shoprite Checkers is a good example, which has moved to many markets or different countries in Africa with opening new stores and supermarkets. Sorry. Okay, the first four were business drivers. Now we're going to be looking at macroeconomic drivers. Okay, so the business drivers are the particular reasons why businesses have gone global. But the other reasons why globalization takes place is macroeconomic drivers, which also links, the first one links up to government drivers, changes in the political environment, i.e. countries have opened their political systems to allow for foreign trade. Big examples of this are China and Russia that used to be communist countries, i.e. foreign business was not welcome in these countries at all. Around the early 80s, the Soviet Union collapsed, and in the late 80s, early 90s, China started opening up their borders to foreign business, and this created all sorts of foreign markets that were previously not available to global businesses. The second driver that we've already mentioned, the second driver that we mentioned in the video is technological environment. Guys, globalization, as I mentioned, has happened because of the advancement of technology. We can now communicate with people across the globe almost at no cost whatsoever. The internet has exploded. You are bombarded with messages from different countries across the globe. You can see what life is in different countries. In fact, you can log on to webcams where you can literally see in real time what is happening in a particular place in a country on the other side of the earth. So technology has created all this interconnectedness, and it has enabled companies to communicate easily with one another. We now have the latest Zoom, which we are all communicating on with the lockdown and the pandemic, etc. All forms of technology. So WhatsApp, Zoom, Microsoft Meetings, Google Chrome, etc. All of these things have created interconnectedness between people, and essentially we have shared culture through the advances in technology, but also the advances in transportation. It used to be very expensive to transport goods across the globe. For example, in the mid-whatever time when the Silk Road was around, it would be very expensive to get silk or to get salt or to get spices, because you had to transport them on camels' backs, and it would take months to transport the goods and services. Today, to get a pair of jeans from China costs approximately R1.50 for the transportation, as it comes in a container, and it literally costs about R1.50 for the transportation costs all the way from China to South Africa. So transportation has become a technological advance that has pushed globalization dramatically. If you go to a supermarket and you want fruit or vegetables that are not in season, you're likely to find fruit and vegetables there that emanate from countries such as Israel or from Italy, etc., that have been either shipped to South Africa or flown to South Africa, and vice versa. Many products are sent from us to Europe by aeroplane on a daily basis, and the cost thereof is minimal compared to 40 or 50 years ago in doing the same thing. The third major driver of globalization has been multinational corporations. I've already mentioned them, I'm repeating myself here, but there's some examples: Adidas, IBM, Coca-Cola, Nike, Sony, Microsoft, Honda, you name it, guys. You look at a brand, it's a global brand, more likely than not. So these multinational corporations have basically persuaded you to buy their goods and services. How have they done this? Through advertising, through social media, etc. They get movie stars to wear their clothes, their sunglasses, their sneakers, etc. And you buy them because it's cool and you want to be the same as these people. So these multinational corporations have changed the food that we eat, the clothes that we wear, the fashions that we follow, the music that we listen to, the shoes that we wear, you name it. They have created a new global culture. And why do they do that, guys? Coca-Cola has persuaded us that it is better to drink flavored water with gas in it than to drink free water that comes out the tap. In fact, Valpre has persuaded us that it's better to drink water that comes out of a bottle and you pay 25 Rand for, than to drink water that comes for free out of the tap. So multinational corporations have dramatically influenced globalization and our tastes and preferences. The next slide just has some examples of multinational corporation: Google, McDonald's, GM, Facebook, hello, huge influencer of our trends in society, in fact, sometimes rather controversially. All of those are brands that you likely know and use their products or services, even if you're not aware of it all the time. Okay, I'm going to go over the international trade theories briefly. Okay, the theories have been developed over the last 400 years. Okay, so they're not explaining international trade, or not all of them are explaining international trade as it stands today. They're also about the evolution of international trade and why international trade has evolved over time. First theory, mercantilism. Okay, mercantilism, what is this about? During the 150 years ago, what happened? I already mentioned the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe by and large. They discovered steam power, later electrical power. What did this mean? That previously goods and services that were produced by craftsmen were now produced in factories en masse. So instead of instead of a craftsman producing one table every 2 or 3 days, you now had a factory producing 100 tables a day. What was the implication? That they needed wood and other raw materials in order to produce these tables, or whatever product that they were doing. So what did they do? They sent out their soldiers and their priests, etc., to colonize the world. So if you look at a map of Africa in the 1800s, you will see that, in fact, into the late 1940s, 1950s, around Second World War, if you look at Africa, it was controlled by either British, Dutch, Portuguese, French, or German interests. So it was basically divided up between these countries. So, and what was the purpose of them colonizing us? South Africa was included in this equation. The purpose was for the colonies to provide the mother country with goods and services, with raw materials that could feed their factories that had opened up because of the Industrial Revolution. The second theory is that of absolute advantage. Adam Smith came up with a theory that said that countries trade globally because some countries have an absolute advantage over others. An example of an absolute advantage is a country that has access to raw materials. So the country with one type of raw material would export that raw material and import another raw material that another country had. So South Africa had gold and diamonds, and for example, the Middle East has oil, so we would import oil and we would export gold and diamonds to those countries. So the point here is the one country has an absolute advantage, i.e. it has something that the other country does not have. Okay, so again, this is a theory that dates back about 150 years. Okay. The third theory, David Ricardo, is a more recent theory. Okay, but also I think Ricardo dates back to probably 40s, 50s. I speak under correction. Okay, but he published a book on principles of political economy and taxation, and he said the world has now become a place where there's unrestricted trade. So rather than absolute advantage, comparative advantage has become more important. What is a comparative advantage? One nation must sell goods that they produce efficiently, and so they export the goods that they produce efficiently, and they import the goods that they produce less efficiently. So, South Africa, we produce agricultural goods very efficiently. So, according to this theory, we export our agricultural goods and our wine, etc., that we produce efficiently, and then we import, let's say, electronic goods that we don't produce as efficiently at the end of the day. So, the world revolves around trade between countries that are better at doing something than other countries. A simple example, England can produce strawberries, but it's very expensive because they have to do them in a greenhouse that has to be heated. Their labor is very expensive. There is limited space, etc., etc. So it costs a lot of money to produce strawberries. So it actually makes more sense for them to import strawberries from South Africa, where we basically just plant them in the ground, put a couple of pieces of plastic over, we have cheap labor to get them out the ground, etc. We produce them more efficiently. The fourth theory sounds quite complex, the Hechler-Ohlin factor proportions theory of comparative advantage. That's a mouthful. Okay. It revolves around factors of production. Okay, so what are the factors of production? Raw materials, labor, money, what have I left out? People, in terms of their skill levels, etc. Now, they argue that similar to David Ricardo, except they say that countries export goods that they use in abundant factors of production, i.e. that they have lots of, and they import products that they have scarce factors of production for. So, similar example as the previous theory, we export agricultural goods because we have abundant factors of production. We've got big farms, we've got cheap labor, we've got a nice climate, it rains regularly, or we hope so at least, etc. So we've got the factors of production to easily produce agricultural goods. We don't have factories to produce computer goods in, but China has vast amounts of factories and also the people, skilled people to produce computers and cell phones, etc. So China exports technological goods and we import the goods from them because they have those factors of production. Important point here is that your factors of production can change over time. So you can skill up your workforce, or you can build factories, or you can get foreign investment, etc. And Singapore is probably the best example of this. Singapore was basically a fishing village that of agricultural community. The people were pretty poor, they produced agricultural goods, etc. The government made a decision to educate their population, and they brought in the best educators in schools, in universities, etc. And Singapore has moved from a country that was pretty poor based on agricultural economy to a first world country that is largely based on a service economy, and one of the richest countries in the globe, based on government's decisions to change their factors of production. Leontief paradox, the fifth theory. Okay, Vasily Leontief predicted Number one, okay, you would predict or you would expect rich countries to produce products that are capital intensive. However, the opposite is true. So the USA, for example, with abundant capital, the richest country on earth, would be expected to export capital intensive goods. But the reality is the US imports capital intensive goods. What's an example? A car. The USA had a large car manufacturing sector, largely located around Detroit in the USA. Today, Detroit is one of the poorest cities in the USA, and they produce almost no vehicles. Why? All the manufacturing has moved to the East and Africa. For example, our car manufacturing plants in East London and PE are examples of this. Why? It is around factors of production, i.e. it is cheaper to produce capital-intensive goods in developing countries than it is in first world countries. So the paradox is that while you expect rich countries to produce expensive goods, they tend to actually import these goods from poorer countries. Okay. The sixth theory is the product life cycle theory, proposed by Raymond Vernon. Okay. So the idea with the product life cycle theory, just like humans have a life cycle, so you are born, you grow, you reach maturity, and then unfortunately you start to decline, and eventually you die. Life's tough. Okay, so guys, but the reality is you can also die at any phase along this line. So you may often, you're probably the most vulnerable when you are a baby, so your probability of dying is greater. Similarly with products, many products die with the introduction, etc. But the product life cycle theory essentially comes down to products are developed in richer countries initially. So let's take flat screen TVs. They were introduced in USA, Europe, etc., rich countries. They were very expensive initially. So they were only available to the rich and well-to-do. So as they grew in popularity, more products were produced, which reduced their fixed expenses, but also as the market grew, competitors started to come into the market, so competition also further forced down the prices. So what happens is, as products become more popular, they grow more competition, greater reductions in prices, which means that you have to sell more products and services, so these products are moved into developing markets. And they also tend to then be produced within these developing markets as their popularity grows over time. And also sometimes products, as they decline in favor in your more developed markets, are then basically shipped off to your less developed markets to get rid of these products as they are busy declining and dying out. Okay, we're almost there. New trade theory. Okay, so new trade theory is based on the assumption actually anyone can produce anything. the idea here, guys, sorry, I jumped ahead with my slides. Okay, guys, the idea with new trade theory. Old trade theory said that sorry about that. Old trade theory was the idea that absolute advantage or comparative advantage. New Zealand has lots of sheep and Thailand has lots of coconuts, so Thailand exports coconuts and New Zealand exports wool and mutton, and they trade with each other. So we are good at different things, and that's why we trade. New trade theory says actually we're similar in abilities. Each of us picks a good for large scale production. So a country decides to invest in particular industries. So be it technology, or here an example, aeroplanes or cars, etc. So a country decides to focus on a particular industry in which they believe that they can gain an advantage, and then it produces goods or services related to that particular industry. So like in South Africa, we've decided to focus on the automotive industry. In the USA, you've got Boeing that produces aeroplanes, and in Europe you've got Airbus that produces aeroplanes, and none of these industries could exist without government support and government not making key decisions to support these industries at the end of the day. So new trade theory basically says anyone can produce anything, but strategic decisions are made to choose particular types of products to sell or to produce at the end of the day. Okay, you should have done these questions already, and I will have given feedback in class, but if you haven't done these questions, I strongly suggest that you sit down and work them out. So the exercise questions, i.e. the previous exercise where you looked at the 2 videos, and these exercise questions, these 5 questions over here, are the questions that you can expect relating to this chapter in your final exam. So it is in your interest to work these out. Okay, I'm not going to give you specific feedback here, given that the questions were dealt with in class, but you also have all the information in the notes here. So you can basically sit down and work them out for yourself. As I said, it is in your interest. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.